Hi, I'm Jonathan, and I'm excited to share with you just a few highlights of how God has used us to impact lives this year. In April, we hosted approximately 150 leaders from around the country for our first Sexual Integrity Leadership Summit. And this event laid the foundation for what we hope will become a strong collaboration of leaders and ministries to equip local churches in championing God's design and purpose for sex in their communities. Future summits are already being planned and scheduled around the country, and we're excited about that. And the new Grace-Based Recovery Small Group Curriculum was released in August. Now, this resource is designed to help people suffering from addiction and those close to them to understand God's grace and why it's the only path to true freedom. Monthly training webinars are being held to educate leaders on how to best use this curriculum. We also launched 2 new courses on our Pure Life Academy training platform. Made for Purity is a course to help men and women understand and apply God's design for sexuality in their lives. And this is a useful course for churches to generate healthy conversations around the topic of sexuality. Parenting for Purity is our comprehensive course for parents to engage their children from ages 5 to 18 on all kinds of issues related to sexuality. It's a great resource to help parents navigate this hyper-sexualized culture. As 2018 closes out, will you help us finish strong and start 2019 with positive momentum? Your partnership is vital to us fulfilling our mission to engage, equip, and expand the Christian pure sex leadership community. We really are better together. You can join with us at give.bebroken.com or just call 210-822-8201. Thanks so much for your time. May God bless you today. Keep pressing on. Good day, radio listeners. Welcome to this edition of the Pure Sex Radio broadcast. We are glad to have you here with us. My name is Jonathan, and we actually have back with us Jessica McDaniel from Austin. And so, Jessica, welcome back to the program.
Thanks. It's good to be back.
Yeah. So before we dive in, because I think we've got a really good topic to talk about this week, I just want to let listeners know, we are just a matter of days, really, away from the end of this year. And as you all know, we are a nonprofit ministry, so the only way that you are seeing us or hearing us on this program is because we've had just generous partners come alongside and donate to this ministry. So with just a matter of days left, we went into this year end with a $75,000 need in order for us to be able to really finish the year strong and enter into 2019 just with some momentum. So if you would like to come alongside and help us really meet and exceed that goal, simply go to puresexradio.com and click on the donate button, and we would be happy to have you partner with us. Well, Jessica, I'm so glad that you were able to come back because, last time we had you on, we were talking about, what happens when a betrayed spouse becomes the one who then betrays. But then as part of that conversation, especially when we got to the part about what does healing look like in that relationship, one of the things we talked about was, hey, confession is necessary. As much as you wanted, Jessica, to figure out a way to say, how can I deal with this in my life and with my husband without ever having to confess it? Clearly, you've discovered that that's not possible.
No.
So let's spend a little bit more time in this episode really trying to unpack, what does disclosure look like? What does confession look like for a couple?
Mm-hmm.
And not maybe just, I'd like for us to get to where it's not just about initial, like maybe there's a mountain of disclosure that needs to happen, but I'd like to talk about what does that look like as an intimacy builder throughout a marriage, realizing that as much as we would like to just have one moment in time where disclosure is necessary and we never have to confess or disclose again, the reality is we all know we're not perfect. And so there's going to be moments and maybe even seasons where we're going to have to continue to confess and disclose. So I'd like to hand it off to you. And before we actually do that, for listeners who maybe did not hear your last program with us, why don't you just let them know who you are, where you're coming from, and what kind of work you do?
Yeah, so I'm a licensed professional counselor at the Austin Stone Counseling Center here in Austin, Texas. And I work with mostly women and couples in a few different areas, but specifically infidelity, betrayal trauma, as well as anything related to kind of parenting, postpartum health. I do kind of that work as well. And so what's interesting is, as you were talking about how can couples get to a point of confessing regularly, where it's not just a one-time disclosure because of a big dark sin, but let that be maybe a rhythm in their marriage. I think most of us kind of buy into the belief that can't it just be this big thing one time? Because the big one's really hard. And so the thought of having to endure pain on maybe a weekly or monthly basis can freak a lot of people out. It can scare a lot of my clients, actually.
And especially when a lot of the struggles that we have on an ongoing nature might link back to those bigger disclosures, right? I remember, just to tell a little story here real quick, I remember in the first few years of my own recovery, of my wife and I getting back together after all of my junk and our separation and all of that, that anytime I had to confess anything that was related to my history, it would like attach us back to that season of where everything that was huge was uncovered. And so I get it. It is difficult. So why don't you help us figure out, like, okay, what does this look like then? I mean, not only we've got to deal with the big stuff, or the big moments, I should say. I don't like to rank, what we have to confess, because that makes us then start to be arbiters of our own, like, well, maybe that's a little thing. I'm not going to need to talk about that.
Sure.
But take us through that process of, okay, what does it look like, first of all, for a big moment of disclosure to happen? And then how do we maybe move more towards this becoming a rhythm in our relationship that doesn't have to derail us every single time we have to share something difficult?
Yeah, so often by the time couples arrive on my couch in my counseling office, there's usually been a big disclosure. There's usually been a big crisis or event. And so they're realizing their need for counseling, that they don't want to walk through it alone, or they've been trying and they don't know how to now walk through it alone. And so by the time they get to me, we're kind of to that point of trying to normalize what just happened, trying to validate that was a good conversation, even though it was really hard and painful and may have ended in conflict. And to then figure out, what does it look like now to continue to keep the door open to this conversation? So oftentimes wives will come in and say, yeah, we talked about it, and he didn't have anything to confess, and so I'm good, like, I don't want to bring it up again. And I actually push women especially to say, well, hey, have you just kind of asked how your husband's doing? Or have you confessed sin to him? And usually the answer is, I don't want to. Do I have to?
Yeah. Well, that's just it. I see this. I've seen this in my own marriage. I see it in other couples, that when you get sort of this lopsided perspective, in the sense that, okay, Jonathan committed these egregious, horrible sexual sins of the deepest betrayal possible in a relationship. And so it seems like, okay, we now have an immediate imbalance where Jonathan's struggle and sin far overshadows anything that his wife Elaine could possibly be struggling with. So if she's having a struggle with, wanting to grab an Oreo, well, hey, that no need to confess that. There's no need, you know what I mean? So I think that's another thing that plays. We start to create this arbitrary imbalance that says, your sin is worse than mine, so you actually have to confess, but I don't need to.
Right. And that's the trap that my husband and I got into personally, because for the few years before I moved towards my own unfaithfulness, there was a lot of awkward and confusing times of confession. And it would often be, well, what have you done? When did you do it? I would just kind of go down the list of questions, almost like in attack mode. He's in defense mode. And I never really thought about, well, how have I sinned against the Lord this week or against my own husband? And how can I bring that too? So what I start to encourage couples to do is to say, first, take a look at where you have fallen short just this week. And can there be a space that you and your husband have, or you and your wife have, that is intentional on a time of confession?
I love what you're saying. There's a lot in what you're saying that even between the lines, I would love for us to unpack. Because one of the things that I want to hear you talk about is, what's even the motivation for confession? Like, what's the point? I think sometimes what happens is not only do we get what I'm talking about here with this imbalance, right, where somebody's sin we think is worse than others, but we start to think of confession as, especially for the one who needs to confess. I think the fear there is we look at it as like, I'm giving ammunition to my spouse, like I'm giving my dirt over to my spouse. And I think when we have that perspective that confession is like leverage, we have the wrong concept of confession. But I love what I'm hearing from you is you're actually saying, no, confession needs to be something that sort of points back towards me. So it's not about what I'm trying to extract from the other person, but it's actually about me examining my own heart and saying, listen, I already know I'm living with an imperfect mate, but I'm also an imperfect mate. And so what is there in me that I'm hiding or that I'm not, bringing into the light that needs to come into the light? So I like the fact that you're kind of shifting the paradigm. You're shifting the motivation for confession, not from being like, what can I pull out of you? Right. But what is it that I need to reveal about myself?
Yeah, and not what do I have to do just so that God will be happy with me, because that's not the gospel. The gospel is God has already freely loved us and sent his son for us so that we would be forgiven of all of our sins. And then as a result of being hidden in Christ, we have right standing with God already. So because we already have right standing with God, when we have run from him in our sin, he's calling us back to him. And so I think the motivation first for confession is to turn back to the Father. Psalm 51, where it talks about search me, God, and know my heart and try me. We have to first ask God to discern our heart and to sift us. And then when we confess to our spouse, it's an overflow of what God has already done. And it's confess to one another so that you may be healed. So forgiveness is between you and the Lord, but confession to your spouse is so that you may experience, I believe, the fullness of healing that God has for you.
Yeah, because I do think there's a difference between what we claim in theory and theology and what we actually experience in our lives and in reality. And I think the bridge that connects those two is what we are willing to speak into the light. Because listen, I experienced this in my own life. I can't tell you how many times before I started recovery, I confessed to God.
Oh yeah.
Thousands of times.
Yep.
And yet didn't experience any freedom, even the freedom that he had already claimed for me. I didn't experience that in my life until I got in a group with other men and go, let me tell you who I really am. Let me tell you what I've done. And also confess to my wife. There's something about speaking that out.
Yes.
But I like what you're saying is that when we understand that our motivation is our right standing with God, our motivation is how are we living before our Maker rather than, kind of playing politics with my spouse. But the other thing about it is I'm hearing you speak as one who clearly has now had a lot of experience in this. So let's think now about our listeners who their teeth are chattering right now. They're petrified because whichever spouse they are, they know they've got things to confess.
Yeah.
And they're thinking, oh, you two sound great. I mean, sounds like it's so easy. Sounds like, oh, this is about my relationship with God. And we're coming from a place of years of experience now being in this, and we don't want to diminish the fears and the real anxieties that surround this issue of confession. So why don't you help kind of talk through maybe some of our listeners who are out there that this hasn't happened yet, but they know that confession needs to happen. How would you help sort of coach them towards that?
So it's been really powerful to me to have the husband or wife who does come in who has not confessed yet, and they have had the courage to share that with me, in a safe, confidential setting. And so I think the Lord is going to begin to use that, right? That courage, that bravery of stepping into the light with another human being, and to be able to then say, okay, I'm, because if people are coming into me, they're hoping and trusting that I'm going to lead them to a place of health and healing. And so when they come to me and wonder, not just should I confess or not, but man, I'm ready to, and I am terrified and I need help. I have someone in particular right now that I'm working with who, and on one hand, wants to confess, to have that burden removed, just the heavy weight that is really keeping them stuck, but also wondering, what does this mean for my marriage? And I share over and over again, you have to trust that the outcome and the result can't be the motivation for doing it in the first place. So we begin to talk about, what would it be like to confess this to your spouse? So sometimes I have them write it out and read through it with me, to be able to think about, who else in my life do I have as a support that I can begin to open up to, and how can I even begin to pray that my spouse could receive what I'm about to share with them.
Yeah. I love what you're saying there, especially about outcomes, because I think that's immediately where all the fears come from.
Yeah.
Is they've painted 100 scenarios in their mind of this conversation. Yes. And I find it fascinating that none of those conversations end in an embrace and forgiveness. It's all like, you're kicked to the curb, you're out, I'm taking the kids, it's all negative. Mm-hmm. And so therefore it keeps them locked in that prison of unconfession.
Yeah.
And so I think fear is one of those huge things that has to be addressed head on. Mm-hmm. Not diminishing the reality of it, not saying it's no big deal, just get over it, quote unquote, have courage. Mm-hmm. It's like, I think there needs to be avenues that we create. And I like what you're saying about, is there a counselor? Is there a trusted friend? Or there's some people that might be able to help you begin to unpack that, or even construct how you're going to communicate this. Because a lot of times, I know that my confession was born out of a place of great selfishness and self-centeredness, because I was suicidal. And there was a part of me that was just saying, I'm probably going to take my life anyway, so I don't want to write a letter, and blah, here, I'm just going to spit it out all on my wife. That's a horrible motivation for making a confession. Even though the confession was necessary, I think there's ways that we can go about it that are empathetic, that are recognizing that this is going to hurt another person.
Yeah, and loving to our spouse. I think sometimes we forget that we, in our own selfishness, are not able to see our spouse with empathy and compassion. And so even trying to put yourself in their shoes, not from a place of worst case scenario, but hey, with what you know about your spouse and how they operate and act and feel, what is that like to imagine being in their shoes? And can you identify with that to such a degree that when you think about confessing, that you can see them as another person who is going to express and experience deep sadness and brokenness, and that you could withstand that discomfort enough to let them have their feelings, to let their feelings be allowed.
And I think that empathy is something that serves you all along the way as you think about confession. And what I mean by that is, yes, if you've never disclosed, something that you've been holding as a secret, that is going to be a big, hairy, painful moment, right?
Yeah.
But if you can learn from that and hold on to all of the emotion that stirs with the mindset that you want to become more empathetic, that will help you down the road even before confession is necessary. Because guess what? The next time you think of doing something that would require confession to this other person, if you're developing empathy for how that would cause them to feel, the golden rule, right? Do unto others, you have them do unto you.
Right.
it might cause you even to resist more temptation because
Right.
you're developing. So that might be one of these things. Talk about that a little bit, about the habit and the rhythm of confession actually aiding and producing and cultivating intimacy in a relationship, because it does help you produce or be more empathetic.
Yeah. So what, and I'll just kind of speak maybe personally how my husband and I do this. We have a regular time of, we call it kind of a marriage check-in as a recommendation from our counselor years ago. And so we have a time once a week where we don't just say, okay, what's your sin and what's your sin? Okay, great, that's done with. But we really get into, how are you doing? And what was it like to kind of struggle with that this week? Or how can I be praying for you? And so we've been doing that for the past, gosh, I don't know, at least 3-4 years now. And we go even deeper than we thought we would. So we, every once in a while, we'll kind of talk about childhood things or other wounds. And so this regular process of confession for a couple opens up so much more. And I think that's what builds intimacy. I'm learning all of these different parts about my spouse that I would have never known, or sharing parts of myself that I would have never shared if we didn't have this regular rhythm of confession. And I think it's key to say not just confession, but praying for and over one another, to remember that it's not left just exposed there, out on the dining room table, but it's truly something then that you can entrust back to God. And so it's intimacy with one another and with God kind of at the same time.
Let's camp out there for a little bit on this idea of the check-in and that kind of stuff, because
Yeah.
help our listeners understand, because they might hear that and go, oh, that sounds great, but I can tell you how that would go in my relationship.
Right.
I would imagine that there are probably maybe a handful of just some ground rules for having that kind of conversation. Why don't you help our listeners think on a practical level of, like, what would that check-in look like for them? What would be the ground rules, so to speak, for that conversation? Like, for instance, I'll give you a little, for instance, when my wife and I got back together and we were working through all of our stuff, we sort of had to establish kind of rules for communication.
Yeah.
And what we called them was fair fighting rules.
Right.
Like, how can we fight fair? I know this isn't necessarily about confession, but it's the same kind of concept of, you got to have some ground rules for how you're going to have these conversations. Like, one of ours was, listen, divorce is never mentioned. That word is never spoken. That is never an idea that we mention. We can fight and, tooth and nail about whatever, but that is not something we ever. So we've sort of drawn a boundary there. What would be some of the boundaries, or maybe some of the guardrails for what you're talking about creating a safe space for couples to have these kinds of confession and prayer times?
Yeah, I would say the first one is, when you pick a day and time, stick to it. Just like you would put on your calendar, your kid's baseball game or church on Sunday morning, that is going to be reserved for that specific thing. So you're not making other plans. If you need to reschedule it, you have to reschedule it. And I would say, in a very practical level, don't let it go longer than an hour. If you are on a roll and you're just having this great, beautiful conversation, by all means, but after about 45 minutes to an hour, one or both of you is going to start to check out. One or both of you is not going to be really engaged any longer. So put a shorter time frame on it, so that you can kind of build up that muscle. And exactly like you said, there are going to be certain words and languages that are not appropriate. So to say, whatever we share in this time, we're going to take a little bit of time individually to process that, and we can come back to it. But if in this moment it's difficult to work through, and I don't think I can be kind in my response, I can say, I'm going to take that in and receive it before we give a response. And then I think the last one, which my husband's great about reminding me on, is I've got to use I statements. Not just the I feel, I think, but anytime I go into, well, you did this and you did that, and so therefore I felt this way, it's attacking. So be careful of judging and attacking language, and instead being willing to say, man, I'm So for instance, when we have these check-ins, I still have some nervousness that my husband might confess a relapse.
Yeah.
That maybe he's looked at pornography or something like that. And it's been a long enough period of time where I don't believe that's the case, but a part of me begins to feel a little anxious. So when I say, gosh, I'm so sorry, I'm just feeling a little anxious today because I know we're going to talk, just about how we're doing in our life. But this is how I'm working through that anxiety, instead of, you know what, I'm feeling like you're untrustworthy, and
Right.
you probably did something to me this week, didn't you? I think that I slipped into that regularly, and so I had to really begin to own, what am I feeling? And so I know I'm getting a little counselory as I talk, but those are some
No,
of
that's
the
good. And
examples.
I think another thing too is kind of getting back to this theme of empathy.
Mm-hmm.
Another thing too is I think it's great in the sense of, yes, keep the focus in terms of the confession on what do I need to bring out? What do I need
Yes.
to share? What am I struggling with? That kind of thing.
Yeah.
But I think also in that same vein, thinking about empathy, those are great conversations where you can move from what I'm kind of putting out on the table
Mm-hmm.
to how can I help you? And
Right.
so when we have that mindset of, because if I think about this, think about what a relationship could look like if
Mm-hmm.
both spouses are owning their
Yeah.
own sin. Therefore, that's really what confession is. Confession is saying, I'm agreeing with what's true. If I did that, I'm just confessing, I'm agreeing with it. Imagine a couple, if both spouses are owning their own sin and
Mm-hmm.
seeking to actually serve one another.
Yeah.
It's like, I mean,
Yeah.
really, where's there room for separation? Where's there room for, I
Mm.
mean, it doesn't make the relationship easy.
Yeah.
What I think it does is it creates that the strength of that foundation of saying that's really what love is.
Yeah.
Love is saying, I already know that
Mm.
you're a broken human being that struggles with sin. The fact that you're putting it on the table and that I actually want to serve you
Yeah.
is a good thing. It's going to build a bond. It's going to create a strength to the relationship. And that's what I think the enemy does. I think the enemy comes in and says,
Mm.
if you show that you're weak, especially with men, this is I'm
Mm.
speaking as a man now. I think
Mhm.
as men, the enemy comes in and says, listen, if you confess and show and admit that you are weak, then she's going to, think less of you and she's not going to be wanting to be around you. And
Right.
in experience, I've found just the opposite to be true in my marriage. When I'm vulnerable, when I express my weakness, when I
Yeah.
confess, it's like it creates a
Mm.
super glue in my wife that she's going, even if that was hard to hear, I'm more attracted to you. I want to be with you more because
Yeah.
you're real instead of a phony baloney plastic, Superman.
Yeah, and until you take the risk of trying, you'll never know what that experience can be like. And it has been so amazing to me to see couples again and again on my couch, almost at two ends of the couch, and they start to kind of talk about these vulnerable things and scary things that maybe they've never really been able to verbalize themselves or to one another, and slowly but surely they're like inching closer and
Right.
closer on the couch. And so our mind tells us in a way, and you're right, the enemy would lead us to believe that is going to push the other person away. But really, when we're feeling vulnerable, what do we want? We want connection, right? We want somebody to move towards us. And I believe that God designed marriage in such a way that our spouses have the ability to move towards us when we are feeling weak and
Yeah.
vulnerable, and it is just, it's beautiful to get to witness that reality, even though it challenges everything that a person would assume.
Right. Well, we are about out of time, Jessica. This has been a great conversation, but why don't you share with our listeners just how they can get in touch with you or learn more about what you're doing in your practice?
Yeah, so you can find me at austinstonecounseling.org. We have a full practice of counselors from a biblical counseling perspective. I realize I didn't mention this last time, but I also lead a group for women. I call it a Sufficient Grace group, and it's for women who have been affected by a husband's unfaithfulness in marriage. And so you can find that through our website as well. And it's an 8-week course that I lead just in person in Austin, Texas. Sometimes it's great to have that face-to-face interaction with other women, breaks the shame.
Wow. Well, this has been a great conversation, and thank you so much, Jessica, for being with us.
Thank you. It was my pleasure.
Yeah. And of course, listeners, we're always glad that you're with us, and we look forward to having you back here again next time on the Pure Sex Radio broadcast. Take care.